And welcome to what is the first in a series of 3 GADRRRES webinars on school safety and COVID-19. I just wanted to put my camera on at the start to say a quick hello, but I might turn it off for now just to ensure we've got the right bandwidth. So let me just flick that off. And let me just get the presentation up. So my name is Kate McFarlane and I'm with Save the Children, one of the many member organisations of GADRRRES. Just to let you know that we will be recording this webinar today and it will go up on the GADRRRES YouTube channel. Now, the agenda for today, I will just start out with a short introduction, and then we will hand over to a panel of speakers who will move through 3 broad themes. So we'll look at the current situation and learning facilities. We will transition to look at transition phase and going back to school. And then we'll talk about future investment. So we're very lucky today to be joined by representatives from different GADRRRES members. From Arup International Development, we have Hayley Greik, who's the Social Infrastructure Lead. We have Vita Sanderson, who's the Social Infrastructure Consultant. And we have Inigo Ruiz Apilanes, who's the WASH Specialist. With Arup and Mass Motion, we have Lachlan Miles, who's the Movement Modelling Specialist. And with IsraAid, we have Anva Ratson, who's the Protection Coordinator and DRR Expert. And then with International Institute for Education Planning at UNESCO, we have Talia Seguin, who's the Associate Program Specialist. So I'd like to warmly welcome all our presenters today. But before I hand over to the presenters, I just want to quickly give you an overview of GADRRRES, because I know there's a lot of new people on the webinar today. So GADRRRES is a multi-stakeholder mechanism. It's made up of UN agencies and international non-governmental organisations and regional networks. And you can see all the member logos up on the screen there. GADRRRES has a mission to ensure all schools are safe from disaster risk and all learners live in a culture of safety. And GADRRRES does this through a number of different efforts, through coordination, knowledge and learning, and advocacy. And the approach that GADRRRES takes is based on the Comprehensive School Safety Framework. And the 4 goals of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework are up there on your screen. They're centred around protecting learners and education, planning for education continuity, safeguarding education sector investments, and strengthening risk reduction and resilience through education. So as mentioned, this is the first of 3 webinars in a series that GADRRRES is offering looking at COVID-19 and school safety. Up there on the screen, you can see the Comprehensive School Safety Framework image, and the 3 circles there, each one represents a pillar of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework. Today's session is on Pillar 1, which is safe learning facilities. We have a session running next week, which is on Pillar 2, school disaster management, and then shortly after, with the date to be announced very soon, we have the 3rd webinar looking at risk reduction and resilience in the education sector. Now, I really encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. you have a question option in your chat box there. We just encourage you to write the presenter's name and to add a question mark at the end so we can identify those questions. So at this point, I will hand over to Hayley.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Kate. So my name is Hayley Grix. I work for a company called GADRRRES. For those of you that don't know, GADRRRES is an international consultancy of engineers, designers, urban planners, architects working in the built environment. And I work for a group within GADRRRRES called GADRRRRES International Development that works exclusively with humanitarian and development organisations, helping to improve the resilience of communities globally. And I'm the social infrastructure lead within that group. And we've been a member of GADRRRES for just over a year. So thank you for everyone to joining today. So as Kate said, the objective of this webinar is to look at the impact of COVID-19 on safer learning facilities, really focusing on Pillar 1 of the Comprehensive Safety School Framework. And we'll be sharing case studies and guidance that might help you as schools start to reopen globally. So if we use the disaster response cycle to frame this discussion, with the closure of schools globally reflecting the immediate response phase after a disaster, we can consider that as schools start to reopen in many countries, we're starting to move towards the recovery phase with the return of formal education to children. We have to recognise that there's been huge effort globally in improving the safety of learning facilities to natural disasters. But now we have a new type of disaster that's also impacting school infrastructure in a very different way. Schools will be used differently as they reopen, and facilities are having to adapt to cope with the demands of a post-COVID world. And this webinar is going to focus on the recovery part with some questions posed at the end to look towards how we can inform investments to achieve a step change in a more resilient education system. So we've got a lot of people from a broad range of backgrounds joining us today. And before we kind of start, I'd just like to take a minute to get an idea of who's on the call and to understand some of the key challenges that you've faced around reopening learning facilities. So if I could ask you, if you are on a desktop or a mobile, if you could go to menti.com and type in the code 950204. There are two questions that we'd like to ask before we begin. What's your role, and what are the key challenges that you have faced around reopening learning facilities? So that's menti.com. It's quite good if you can do it on your mobile. It's easy to do it on your mobile if you have a smartphone, and enter that code, and it should take you straight to those two questions. So while you're doing that, and just as we're bringing up the results, GADRRRES members, as GADRRRES members, we're continually looking to support practitioners as yourselves to provide guidance and tools relating to school safety. So as much as our focus is on the impacts of natural disasters, we will be thinking about how our activities might need to be reviewed, adapted and reprioritised in light of this COVID pandemic. So we hope that today in this webinar, we will address some of your key challenges, either today or in the future GADRRRES webinars over the next few weeks. But your answers will also provide us with some useful insights for future considerations, and also an opportunity really just to share some of your key challenges with each other. So I can see we've got a large number of program managers and others. So that's good. So as the results are coming in, we'll just give it a moment, and then we'll flick to see some of maybe what your key challenges are, and to see if there's any commonalities. So can we switch to the next slide? So I think we haven't seen, if you can go to your next question, see what some of the key challenges you're facing around reopening learning facilities. Government restrictions. You only have one person that so far has responded to that. I'll give it a moment, but if it's not going to, it might just take a while to come in. So socially distancing in school, we might focus on some of that today, and limited space. Protocol, so limited space and protocol seem to be a big aspects. Lack of resources, yes, I assume that's also not just learning resources, but also teachers maybe. Fear. So government restrictions is also very key. So this is really interesting. So thank you for that. We'll keep going just in terms of time so we can get through everything, but we will definitely be looking at those as they come in, and we can see how we consider them for future considerations in terms of addressing some of those challenges that you're facing. So lack of resources seems to be the key issue for many of you. Okay, can we switch back to the slides? Okay, thank you. So as most of you are aware, COVID-19 has had a huge impact on education around the world, and it's affected almost all school children globally. So this impact on the provision of education to children is unlike any other we've seen before. Natural disasters and other shocks and stresses are typically defined to a specific area, region or country, and this is obviously affecting us everywhere. So currently countries are starting to reopen some of their schools, and this is shown in the shown by the pink areas on both the graph and the map that you can see. So we need to start thinking about what this means for learning facilities as these children return to school. So these figures were drawn from yesterday's, they were from yesterday from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics data. So before I pass over to the other speakers and go into the main section of the webinar, which is focusing on the recovery phase, I just want to touch briefly on a case study from Nepal, where learning facilities are being used as COVID-19 quarantine centres. So in fact, in Nepal, the majority of COVID-19 quarantine centres have been set up in schools or learning facilities, as you can see on the graph there on the slide. Schools are currently still closed in Nepal, but this is also impacting the recovery phase for preparations going back to school. So this is the case in one of the programs that we're working on, which is DFID's Nepal's Safer Schools program, where we're retrofitting approximately 2,000 classrooms in Western Nepal, particularly retrofitting them in relation to seismic, to earthquakes. But in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the programme is now also looking to upgrade wash facilities in the schools within the project that have previously been assessed for poor quality. So those schools that are now being used as kind of isolation or quarantine centres now have to be deprioritised, as we're unable to know when we'll be able to access those premises. So whilst we have to recognise, well, whilst there's a need for isolation or quarantine facilities, and this is hugely important and essential for helping to control the spread of the virus, the use of learning centres or facilities as isolation centres is going to delay further the reopening of schools for children's education. But it's also important to highlight that there will be a need for significant cleaning and disinfection before those schools are used, essentially delaying further the reopening of schools or undertaking intervention work that is needed to improve the safety of those schools to other hazards that they are exposed to. So I'm now going to pass over to Talia from IIEP UNESCO, who's going to provide some more guidance on planning and managing school reopening.
Thank you very much, Haley, and to all of you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be part of this GADRRRES webinar. My name is Talia Seguin, and I'm an Associate Program Specialist at the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning. I understand we've had some problems with sound and video, so I'm going to turn off my video now for the rest of the presentation. But thank you again for being with us. So despite the fact that there is still uncertainty about the end of the pandemic, some countries have already reopened schools, and many governments have started considering how to approach school reopening. This planning effort can be challenging. It must take into account the complexity of the national and subnational situations and the multifaceted impact of the pandemic. In addressing critical and immediate actions related to school reopening, three main questions deserve your attention. Timing, when can the reopening of schools happen? Conditions, what preconditions should be in place before schools reopen? And processes, how to organize this reopening of schools. On the timing of reopening of schools, there is consensus that the absolute priority is to safeguard the life and well-being of populations. The pressures to reopen are numerous: economic, political, social, and educational, including concerns that school closures have worsened inequalities. However, parents, teachers, and school communities first and foremost need to have reasonable confidence that the school system can protect the overall health and well-being of students, teachers, and other education personnel. This leads us to the second question: what are the conditions for system readiness for school reopening? In some countries, these conditions will be very localized. Linking back to the first issue, the most important preconditions for school reopening are related to physical protection. That is, the prevalence of the virus, starting with the least affected communities or regions, and ensuring safe hygiene conditions in schools. Additional considerations requiring attention are the availability of school personnel, especially teachers, and the capacity of local administrations and institutions to implement the required changes. Once the authorities deem that the preconditions have been met, the third question of how to reopen schools can be tackled. Facing the numerous considerations required for deciding how to go about reopening can be challenging for governments, and trade-offs will be required. To support governments in this regard, guidance has been developed to help orient countries as they determine how to reopen schools. The framework for reopening schools, developed by UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and the World Food Programme, serves to inform the decision-making process on when, why, and how to reopen schools, support national preparations, and guide the implementation process as part of overall public health and education planning processes. As reflected in the graphic, the framework includes 6 key dimensions to assess states of readiness and inform planning once select schools have been identified for reopening: safe operations, learning, reaching the most marginalized, well-being and protection, policy, and financing. Policy considerations and financial requirements together create the enabling environment needed to support each of the other dimensions. The framework provides guidance on actions to be carried out before, during, and after school reopening. The first dimension on safe operations stresses the importance of safe school facilities through, for example, increasing the share of schools with safe water, hand washing stations, and cleaning supplies, and developing cleaning procedures for learning facilities. For practitioners, this guidance could be used as a way to advocate for school maintenance and improvement. I would also like to draw your attention to Safe Back to School, a practitioner's guide, developed by the Global Education Cluster, which can be seen as a way to operationalize the framework. Its Safe Back to School checklist includes elements related to ensuring that facilities are safe. This includes, for example, guidance on maintaining physical distancing within and around schools through staggering start times and lunch hours, using several entrances to avoid crowding, amending class sizes and seating plans, providing additional school supplies to avoid sharing equipment, and establishing temporary learning spaces. For practitioners, this guide, which also links to key resources and existing standards, can be referred to for key steps for a coordinated, inclusive, all hazards approach to school reopening. This guide will be discussed in more detail during the GADRRRES Pillar 2 webinar on school disaster management. Before concluding, I would just like to return to the idea of the enabling environment formed by policy and financing mentioned earlier. Even once schools reopen, it is important to keep in mind that governments may be faced with a need for continued adaptations. The decreasing level of financial resources of states due to the coronavirus pandemic may jeopardize the implementation of education development plans, and schools may be forced to close again in the event of a resurgence of the pandemic. In this regard, the readjustment of strategic plans of many countries will be necessary. If they have not already done so, countries may also choose to adapt existing disaster management policies and plans to account for the specific nature of risks posed by disease outbreaks. In the longer term, the aim is to build sustainable and resilient education systems. The frequency of various crises affecting education systems over the last decade, coupled with the risks associated with climate change, highlight the importance of addressing the risks of crises systematically when formulating education policies and plans. Countries must therefore reinforce their resilience capacities by acquiring the tools, methods, administrative, and political organization necessary to overcome and rebound from possible crisis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Talia. Hi, everyone. My name's Lachlan Miles. Thank you very much for the chance to present. I'm just going to go through one very quick case study that allows us to address some of the things that we've talked about earlier and some of the feedback that we got about how can we possibly socially distance in schools. So in order to save bandwidth, I'm going to turn off my camera and we'll go through one particular case study for how we can potentially do this in various different ways and how we can assess those impacts. So as we heard at the start of this presentation, of this webinar, there are a lot of different issues with both returning to schools and how we can do that in a safe way and how we can potentially modify schools and modify some of these areas in order to ensure that we can do things in a safe way effectively. And one way we can do this is using existing or changed space planning tools in order to understand the way that people move through a space and understand the way that we can potentially change operations in order to assess the impacts of what those changes would be. And so one way in which we can do this is using different simulation tools. And I'm going to briefly see if I can share my screen. But if people can't see it due to bandwidth issues, that's totally okay. And I'll just explain it. But one of the things that we're going to go through is looking at a typical school case study. What are some changes that can be made as we return back to the school environment from a circulation perspective? So how do we ensure that from a human flow and from moving students around or moving staff around our facility, that we can do that in a safe way, and we can put in some low cost and some different interventions that allow us to organize our space in a way that reduces our risk without massively redesigning our spaces, and different ways that we can change operations. So let me just go through this. And so this is one of a number of tools that is available, which allows for effectively how to quantify some of this and how to change some of these interactions and test various different scenarios. And really, when we're talking about the school environment, one of the things, because every school is going to be different, every teaching plan is going to be different, and one of the key things is effectively how do we prioritize flow and potentially how do we make some operational changes in order to not overall change design. And so one of the things that we're going to look at is what are the different, just for a typical school, one of the things that we can potentially do are things like if you have stairs, escalators, those sorts of things, how do we prioritize one-way flow? How do we potentially do things like change class timetables? So what we have going on here was basically a way in which we can quantify some of these things. And so let me just move back to the slides. Fantastic. And so from those simulations, one thing that we can effectively see is you can then, rather than just showing things visually, you can start to quantify the time that people spend within proximity and how long people actually are at risk. And so what we have on the screen now is we have 4 different scenarios where we're not actually changing class sizes and we're not changing anything in terms of making any costly interventions. And so this is from a baseline where we have certain clusters of people moving around. What happens if we can kind of target either one-way circulation systems within corridors, or what can we do in terms of staggering our timetables in order to move different people around? And so what we can see is there are tools out there that enable us to look at particular schools, but one thing that I think in a generalized way is focusing really on how do we prioritize clear movement of people, and how do we do things like change signage and shift things like timetables in order to potentially split the numbers of people that we have in a particular classroom, or how we can sort of move back in a way that we're not massively changing some of these spaces. And so this just gives a way in which we can quantify some of these changes and ways in which we can start to assess the impact of various different changes. And so hopefully that's a useful case study looking at some of these different combinations and showing that there are pathways in which we can understand the way people can reopen schools in a safe and kind of managed risk way. Thank you very much for your time.
So, hello everyone, I'm Anva from East-Raid, humanitarian aid organization. I'm a protection coordinator and a DRR expert, and I would like us to look on different aspects on going back to school, and also there can be a preparedness lines that we can follow them. And part of the DRR approach for us in Israel is how to increase the resilience when people going back to school. And basically what we would like to do is to reduce symptoms of stress and fear, as you all mentioned also in the post. So how we do that? We're trying to increase the sense of control and to increase the sense of efficacy in the student and the community, the school community. So for doing that, there are aspects that we will need to ask ourselves if we have them. For example, if we can plan to have a plan for different scenarios in school emergency teams for all hazard approach. I'm sorry, I don't have the presentation. Yeah, for all hazard approach. How can we talk and get to know the caregivers of the children and to be in touch with them? If we have clear guidelines to share with the caregivers and with the teachers and with the student, that they will know exactly what to do in time of emergency and before the emergency, or even now when they're going back to school after COVID-19. Things that are very important as well is to have psychosocial tools and awareness raising in the teachers and in the students. How can I self-regulate myself? And how can I help also students to regulate themselves? Another thing that we need to ask many times, the guidelines can be to go back to school, but people won't have any transportation to go to school. So it's things that we need to also to consider when we're going back to school. How we share the information. So we have a lot of information and a lot of guidelines how the student needs to go to school. So how we communicate that is everyone has internet access or emails or smartphones. So we need to think how we can share the information with the caregivers and the teachers and the student. And if we and for places that are not back to school and they have online learning platforms, to see if they all have access to the network to see how they can learn. So this is on one hand. The other hand of COVID-19 now, when schools are to reopen again, we need to understand a few things on the psychosocial aspects when we're going back to school. First of all, I think the COVID-19 brings for us a change of language. Okay, so we have social distance and we have quarantine and we have lockdown, and we need to see how we address it and how we help children as well to change their habits. Because if before children used to hug each other and to stand very closely, we need to see how we can help them with the teacher's help to change their habits. Another thing we need to consider is that we have probably students that can be in risk, teachers that can be in risk, and also caregivers that are, or families that are in risk, and that can bring more anxiety, and it's taking us back to the psychosocial tools to teach, to help them to regulate them. And I think you spoke about it a lot, how we adapt the infrastructure in the schools for the reopening. So the stress many times coming from the sense of helplessness, the sense of loneliness, and I think when we think about all those aspects about how we react, it helps to increase the sense of control, and it can help to reduce the sense of helplessness. When we have a commitment with the student, show them that we are there and we can help them, it can help also to increase those aspects. And now I would like to share with you a case study that we had in Mexico. So you see on the left side, this is a guide that we developed with the Ministry of Education of Mexico and the Protection Civil. And basically, Israel got to Mexico after the earthquake in 2017, and immediately we started to work with the education sector and in the education and the Ministry of Education together. And already in 2018, we started to have a pilot program with the ministry, and we built in the state of Morelos in Mexico school emergency teams with the school community. It means with the parents and with the students. They map all the schools to know all the exit points that they can go away in case of earthquake or in different kind of scenarios. And they got psychosocial tools for the student and for the teacher for interventions. In 2019, we already scaled up, and it became a national plan in Mexico for the Safe School program. And our focus was the students are in the center, and everything is around the student and how we can reduce the risk with the student and the community. It was a child-centered approach. And all of this platform that we built from 2017 really helped us to get to this point that in COVID-19, when schools stopped in Mexico, we could start to have a new program with the school emergency teams that we built already in the routine, and to provide classroom hygiene kits, and also to have webinars with all the teachers and the school communities and students about hygiene promotion when they go back to school. Already if you remember, we talked about the information and the communication and how we can address it and to change the language and etc. So we could prepare the students for the going back to school on hygiene and medical. So I think all of it wouldn't be able to achieve if we wouldn't work on the work plan and the school emergency teams and the school preparedness. And if we want to have a good collaboration with the Ministry of Education on the in the preparedness when we start to prepare the schools. So thank you very much.
Hi, Inigo. You just need to click on the microphone on the black box. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us. We're just having a few IT issues. Just one moment. There we go, Inigo. Your microphone is activated. We'll give it one more go. Did you want to try speaking, Inigo? Yes, that sounds good. Are you there? Excellent. We're getting closer. I can see your camera, and let's give the mic a go.
You cannot hear me. Sorry. Hello? Is it working now? Okay. All right. So third time, hopefully it's working. So my name is Inigo, and I am WASH consultant in Arab International Development. And I just wanted to highlight about some of the most important things in relation to WASH. So yeah, I think In relation to wash, the most important area to improve right now is going to be hygiene. So making sure that teachers and students wash their hands with soap and water for a minimum of 40 seconds. So that is going to be one of the most critical actions really to spread the disease or to spread COVID as well as any other respiratory and stomach illness across the school. To ensure that this is possible, which is going to be very important, is that schools have enough units across the entire facility, and make sure that those units are constantly operated and maintained in a good way, that they have accessible water and soap, and also very important that the units are going to be appropriate for students of all ages. So quite good, and recently quite a few compendium and studies have come out, both from UNICEF and from the Institute of Development Studies. I have copied here a couple of links, but if you Google, there are quite a few of them that are coming out, and pretty much all of them, they're coming to some key characteristics that are very important around the hand washing unit and how they should be located and placed around the schools. So in terms of location, I think it's important that there are multiple units and that they are, of course, outside the toilets, but now it's being very important that they will be also near to the entrance of the classes and near the canteens, and that they clearly don't have any barrier or any accident, so they are very easy to access. As I was mentioning previously, it's not only about having the hand washing unit, but also about keeping and maintaining and making sure that water and soap are accessible at all time. So in terms of water, you can estimate around 250 to 350 ml for water use. So based on that and the amount of students that you have and the amount of wash per day that you can estimate, you can start calculating the amount of water that you're going to require, then see if you're going to need to refill once or twice per day, depending on the size of the water tanks that you may have. In terms of soap, the preference right now, it's been liquid soap, so it's avoiding a constant second point of contamination with other students. As you know, liquid soap is quite easy to make also from soap bar, so that is something that it's been quite encouraging. The drainage from the wash point for the hand washing points are also going to be a key point. So making sure that all that new water now is not going to get stagnant. So we start to avoid any risk of vector disease, and also to keep promoting hand washing. I think it will be very important to display any board or posters, or many of them across the school. So people keep reminding constantly about the students to have their wash their hand. Then in terms of what type of facility, well, there are quite a few out there now that they're coming out. I put here some of the key principles that they would be quite important for a hand washing unit. So we were mentioning already that location, but it will also be important. Its robustness, how you're going to manufacture, how easy to transport it, how easy to maintain. So in those compendiums, you will see quite a few examples. Today, I'm going to share a specific unit called Jengu. This is a project that ARUP has been working together with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the British Red Cross for a couple of years. And I think it really satisfies all those requirements that we were talking before that you would need. This is the adult side, but you also have a kid size and also even a reduced mobility one. And it has all these little features that they are very important to increase the behavior of hand washing unit. Simply, the first of all is actually that it looks like a hand washing unit. So that it's pretty good. And also it has some key facts that improves the time that people are going to wash their hand, as for example the mirror that you don't need to bend. The water is fed through a foot pump which provides two key assets. One, that the water doesn't need to be gravity fed, so it's much easier to refill any large tank. It can be connected to other things, and also that you are avoiding a second point of contamination that you often need when you need to close the tap or so. Because they are individual units, they can be distributed all across the school, and you can also link quite a few together to the same water source if you required. They are all manufactured in metal, so it's quite easy to locally manufacture them, and they are very, very robust and very difficult to steal, because they are all pop riveted, and you can link it through different points, once to each other or to different places. So yeah, now we're planning to launch a website around next week where you can download all the drawings. It's an open source design, or please contact me. And also they have been now included in some of the compendiums that I was mentioning previously. So yeah, thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Vita Sanderson. I am a social infrastructure specialist in ARUP's international development team. I am also just going to turn off my video there just so that we save some bandwidth, but I'm just going to wrap this up by talking a bit about what we can do to look forward and what sort of things we should be considering as we move through the recovery phase. So as we move beyond recovery in the future, it will be important for us to consider how we might reduce the impact on continuity of education for any future event. Therefore, as schools restart operation, this is the moment in which we can collect the evidence and the information which will help inform this improved quality of school infrastructure in the future. What worked well, what didn't work so well, what do you wish you had? So just referring back to that disaster cycle diagram that Haley talked through at the start, we need to think about what kind of interventions or design changes we can implement in school learning facilities that will provide the improvements that will help us make that step change from disaster preparedness through to resilience. So while we're at the very relatively early stages of the response, so we don't have all the answers yet. So what we've done is prepare a number of questions that we think it's worthwhile thinking about this time, but also to bear in mind in the coming few months as you grapple with the school reopening. So some of those aspects might be what's hindered the effective response and what's provided an efficient recovery. What innovation did you see? What practices emerged that were really positive and you think would be worthwhile integrating into future planning and design? Who do you wish you talked to earlier to capture this? Who's worthwhile talking to as we think about these things in the coming months? And what synergies are there between interventions that respond to learnings from the crisis, and how would those support improvements to education and other social, environmental, and risk reduction benefits? And then how might we influence policy and regulation and design norms to really scale up these learnings for the future when we're looking at school infrastructure? So if you already have some ideas, I invite you to share these on the Menti link shown. So just like we did at the beginning, on your mobile device or on your browser, go to menti.com and enter the code you can see at the top. As we're running quite short on time, I'm going to switch straight back to Kate for questions that I can already see heaps in the chat, but we will definitely collate any thoughts you have on these at the end of the session, and yeah, we really value your input on those, but also to think about as we go forward. Thanks. Kate.
Okay, so now we move to question time. Just a reminder, can I ask, if you're asking a question, if you could put the name of the presenter, if you know, first, and then a question mark, just so we can easily pick it up. Now, we've had a lot of requests for copies of the PowerPoint, the case study, links to a lot of the materials mentioned, including a detailed image of the hand washing unit. So we will arrange all of those in a follow-up email for you all so you can have your hands on them. So we might move to the first question. Just one moment. There we go. And all the presenters, you have microphones which are enabled, so you can click on the microphone to answer. So this one is for Talia. How to manage in a school where we have 40 to 70 students in a class?
Thank you so much. Really, this is an excellent question because this is a situation that is common in a lot of countries and that definitely can be a challenge. So the first thing that I'd like to mention, particularly referring to the UN framework for reopening schools, is this question of timing. So really the priority is to safeguard the life and well-being of populations. If this is something that does not seem possible, then perhaps it's necessary to wait a little bit longer. So I think it's really important that countries don't feel necessarily that it has to be a rush if this safety element isn't something that can be ensured to a reasonable extent. One of the strong points of the framework is that it really highlights the key questions to be asked, looking at the risks and the capacity of schools to be able to protect students, as well as the benefits of returning to the classroom. It also, I saw another question came up about this element of how important it is that any response is context specific, and I absolutely couldn't agree more. Strategies that may work in one context might not work at all in another, so it's extremely important, and I think that comes across in both of the documents which I mentioned, this need to really adapt to the particular context. In terms of a couple of strategies or approaches that we've seen in countries, first off, we've seen that some countries have chosen to prioritize the return to school for certain age groups. This two kind of different, but examples of what we've seen quite frequently are some countries have chosen to prioritize younger students returning to the classroom, in part because there is a sense that they might have a harder time, younger learners might have a harder time learning at a distance, and also to be able to provide some relief for families who have been oftentimes juggling work-related responsibilities as well as childcare responsibilities. And others have chosen to prioritize older students who may be returning for final examinations. So age could be a factor. Also, some countries have looked more at prioritizing the return for vulnerable children or students without access to distance learning modalities, to ensure that that the gap doesn't widen in terms of students being left behind. And then also, as I mentioned, this idea that specific regions or areas might be able to return to school a little bit more quickly. And in terms of the particular approaches, so I think I mentioned a couple of them, but shifting could be one possible solution. Again, it would depend on how many students you're starting off with and which age groups or groups you decide to start off with. We've also seen outdoor learning spaces that some schools are looking to see if they could also hold some classes outdoors. And then also this idea that blended learning could potentially be an option as well, to continue with some distance modalities and then also have some face-to-face exchange in more in a shifting type of approach. Thanks. I'm not sure if this next question is for me as well in terms of the guidelines for small group learning during COVID. I would say that at least the idea with the UN framework, and then as well with the practitioner's guide, is that they could be adapted to, the guidance could be adapted to different levels. So the guidance there could definitely be adapted to different sizes of groups, and could be used at different levels to help plan a return to school. Thank you.
Talia.
Just getting my mic back on. Okay, so we have this question about returning back to school being a challenge, and working for reliable remote education systems and a partial reopening of schools. So I think this kind of is covered a little bit in my response to some of the other questions about this idea that indeed a partial reopening, depending on which groups are targeted, could be one approach. I think one thing that we've seen a lot is the importance of having a hybrid approach to distance learning. So this idea of having high tech, low tech, and no tech options really is the best way of being able to try to ensure that students will be able to be reached regardless of their context. A number of countries, as we understand, this is still very much a struggle to reach all students. It's also quite difficult, at least from what we've seen so far, to get a sense of the effectiveness of the different distance learning modalities. I understand that a lot of countries are looking at this at present, but to be able to say with certainty, these are particular modalities that work best, it definitely is a challenge. So I think, again, the issue of something that's context specific really is at the forefront of this question. Something that's reliable in one context might not work in another, but I think it really is this idea of approaching it with having various options in order to find, what is the best fit for the particular context. And again, I'm not necessarily referring to a country context, because as we know, even within countries, there can be a pretty wide spectrum of, for example, internet connectivity. So it really is important to kind of have this broader approach when we're talking about distance learning modalities.
For one last question, and it looks like this one is for Lachlan. Most schools in Southern Africa do not have proper infrastructure. Some schools use containers as classrooms and accommodate more than 55 learners in one class. Will the measures suggested work?
I think from a fundamental perspective, echoing what Talia was just saying, there are some aspects where you're effectively dealing with you need to put safety first, and so if the only option is to have a significant number of people in a small space where it's not possible to physically distance, I think you're then leaning on some of those other, if you can reduce the class size in some way. So can you, as Talia was saying, remove some of those like middle-aged students in terms of prioritizing one particular age group or other. Really, from some of the studies that we've found, and this is has gone throughout this presentation and this webinar, is every school is quite different, and so it's quite hard to sort of generalize some of this. And so what I would say, just in terms of principles, is that if it's impossible to have safe circulation, in terms of splitting that up and reducing that, then I would suggest kind of moving towards at least reducing class size or extending the class day in some way. I realize that likely has impacts on teachers, but that's something that we have explored, and we're currently exploring a couple of case studies with different levels of infrastructure in schools, and I think be happy to share that at some stage. So I think hopefully that addresses the question.
Afraid we have run out of time now, but we have all of your questions noted down and we will follow up on them in the follow-up email. But I also encourage you to cross over to the Safe Children, Safe Schools community of practice, which is offered by GADRRRES, and continue the conversation there as well. Just before we wrap up, we have a short survey. We want to hear back from you about how we're delivering webinars and how we can improve on them in the future. So there's just 3 different questions to answer on the screen. The first one being, the webinar objectives were met. So just responding to how you feel about that. Thank you. I can see the responses coming in. And then the second question, the webinar content will be useful for my work. And the third one, how satisfied are you with the online forum today? So on that note, I would like to thank all our presenters and all of you for attending today, and I hope we can keep the conversation happening and alive on safer learning facilities and COVID-19. Please join us next week for the webinar looking at Pillar 2. And do stay in touch and link up with GADRRRES on their website. So thank you everyone, and have a good morning, afternoon and evening wherever you are.